She stepped into the room, and the first thing she noticed wasn't the rows of chairs, the polished table, or even the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. What hit her first was the sheer number of people gathered there, all facing her, all waiting. It wasn't just a meeting. It was a battlefield of opinions, ideas, and authority. Every eye seemed to carry a question, a judgment, a subtle expectation that she would falter, that she would shrink into the background. She was the only one on her side, alone in a room full of opposition. From the moment she opened the door, she felt it, the weight of being outnumbered. Each step across the floor seemed louder than necessary, echoing in the silent acknowledgement of how starkly different she was in that environment. Others had arrived earlier, taken their seats with the casual comfort of familiarity. They were organized, confident, accustomed to the rhythm of group consensus, of agreements that formed like a tide washing over anyone who dared to stand apart. She had no such tide behind her, only the small, steady pulse of her own resolve. She could feel the tension in the air, subtle but unmistakable. Conversations halted as she approached, the hum of quiet anticipation following her every move. Some glanced at her with curiosity, others with polite indifference, and a few with barely hidden skepticism. She wasn't just physically alone. She was alone in influence, alone in expectation, alone in the sense of responsibility that rested on her shoulders. The room seemed to grow larger with every step she took, not in size but in the awareness that she was the minority, the single voice against a chorus of differing perspectives. Sitting down, she tried to find a point of grounding, some corner of the table or a glance that might make her feel less exposed. But the space around her offered no comfort, no shield. Each person in that room had their own agenda, their own measure of authority, their own confidence bolstered by numbers. They could lean on each other, nod in agreement, create momentum that she didn't yet have. And she realized that being alone wasn't just a matter of numbers. It was the sense that every assertion she made, every point she raised, would have to carry weight far beyond the simplicity of words. Alone meant that there was no safety net, no one to echo her ideas, no buffer between her and the potential dismissal that could come from even a casual shrug or raised eyebrow. She noticed the subtle ways people reinforced their own collective presence. Laughter shared between two, a knowing glance across the table, the ease with which they interrupted or overlapped each other's thoughts. She could feel the rhythm of their familiarity, the unspoken dance that comes with shared experience. And yet, she also noticed that their unity, as strong as it seemed, wasn't impenetrable. It had cracks, small gaps where a well-timed observation or an unexpected perspective could shift attention, even momentarily. But to reach those gaps, she would have to move carefully, with precision, with a clarity of thought that compensated for her lack of sheer numbers. Her mind began to map the room. Not the furniture, not the walls, but the currents of conversation, the angles of influence. She noticed who spoke first, who waited to respond, who relied on others to validate their points. Being alone didn't mean being passive, it meant being vigilant. Every gesture, every pause, every carefully chosen word had to be intentional. She realized that being alone was not just a disadvantage, it was also a lens. She could see patterns that others, secure in their majority, might overlook. She could spot assumptions, contradictions, and unspoken rules in ways that the crowd itself could not. Her solitude offered clarity if she could harness it. The first moments of dialogue were the hardest. Speaking up meant breaking the rhythm of the room, interrupting the invisible current that carried consensus like a river through the discussion. She could feel eyes tracking her words, evaluating them, weighing them against the combined authority of everyone else. There was a tension in her chest, a quiet question of whether she could maintain composure, whether she could project confidence despite the isolation. She realized that being alone in a room full of opposition wasn't about bravery in the abstract. It was about focus, about controlling the small details, tone, pacing, phrasing, eye contact, so that she became, for those moments, the center of attention not by force, but by intention. And as she continued to speak, she began to notice subtle shifts. Heads tilted slightly, a hand that had been poised to write now resting, a frown replaced by a look of consideration. Being alone in that room didn't automatically mean being powerless. It meant that each action, Each word, each carefully chosen phrase carried weight precisely because it was solitary. She had no backup, no echo, no chorus to support her, which paradoxically made her voice sharper, more concentrated, more impossible to ignore. Her awareness sharpened further. Alone didn't just define her numbers, it defined her perspective. She could listen differently, notice differently, think differently. The very isolation that had felt like a vulnerability became a kind of vantage point, a place from which she could see the room in ways that those who relied on collective reinforcement could not. She was aware of every shift, every glance, every pause, and she began to use that awareness not just to survive, but to navigate the conversation with intentionality. Alone in a room full of opposition, she realized, wasn't a sentence. It was a condition, a challenge, and a mirror, reflecting both the difficulty and the opportunity of standing solo. She had always known that some battles were bigger than one person, but nothing quite prepared her for this moment. From the outside, it looked simple, another meeting, another discussion, but from the inside, she felt the weight of every expectation, every doubt, every challenge pressing down on her. Facing overwhelming odds isn't just about the numbers or the voices. It's about the sense of being surrounded, encircled, and having every instinct tell you that the easier path would be to step back, to yield. She could feel the room leaning against her, not in a literal sense, but in the quiet, constant pressure of collective certainty that her ideas wouldn't prevail. She thought about the stakes. Every person in that room represented experience, influence, and habit. They had established norms, comfortable routines, and a shared understanding that had been built over years. To challenge that, even with logic, evidence, or passion, was to swim against a current that had been flowing long before she arrived. The odds weren't just numerical, they were structural. Every objection, every dismissive glance, every skeptical murmur reminded her that she was the exception in a system built for conformity. Her own doubts whispered louder with each passing second. What if she couldn't convince them? What if her points were misinterpreted, ignored, or, worse, dismissed outright? The fear wasn't just about failure. It was about being erased in the conversation, her voice blending into the background while the consensus marched on without her. She could feel the tension in her chest, a rhythm of anxiety that pulsed with every nod, every glance, every subtle exchange between others. And yet, within that tension, there was a spark, an understanding that facing overwhelming odds required more than courage. It required clarity, strategy, and the willingness to stand, even when the outcome seemed unlikely. She started to break down the room in her mind, mapping potential allies, silent listeners, and the ones whose skepticism was most visible. The odds weren't purely against her. They were layered, nuanced, and open to small shifts. Each person had a trigger, a point of connection, a way that her perspective might resonate. But finding those threads in a room that seemed designed to drown out difference required patience and precision. She had to move carefully, calibrating her words, her tone, her timing, so that each idea landed with the greatest possible impact. The first few moments of speaking were a test. Every assertion was scrutinized, weighed, measured, and compared against the prevailing assumptions. Her heart raced, her mind raced faster, searching for ways to make the impossible seem possible. Facing overwhelming odds wasn't a matter of raw strength. It was a game of attention, perception, and subtle influence. A well-placed example, a carefully chosen statistic, a story that humanized the abstract. All of it mattered far more than sheer volume or force. She realized that the larger the opposition, the more critical it was to focus on precision and authenticity. She could feel the invisible walls closing in, the pressure of expectations and assumptions pressing like gravity. Every point she made had to anticipate a dozen counterpoints. Every suggestion had to be supported before it was even questioned. Yet in that pressure, she found an unexpected clarity. Facing overwhelming odds demanded not only mental acuity, but emotional resilience. She had to control the urge to react defensively, to shrink, to speak too quickly. Instead, she learned to breathe through the tension, to observe, to listen, and then to respond with intention. Her awareness extended to the subtleties of the room. The way some leaned forward indicated curiosity. The way others crossed arms revealed skepticism. Every gesture, every pause, every slight change in tone was a clue in a complex puzzle she had to navigate while holding firm to her own convictions. The overwhelming odds weren't just about numbers. They were about the dynamics of influence, the ebb and flow of attention, the invisible forces that shape decision-making even when no one speaks them aloud. She began to notice small openings, moments where the tide could be shifted. A question left unanswered, a statement that hadn't been fully examined, a glance from someone whose expression hinted at reconsideration. These weren't victories, not yet, but they were signs that even overwhelming odds could bend under pressure, that persistence combined with insight could create change. Every word, every carefully measured gesture, became a tool to chip away at assumptions, to plant seeds of doubt or curiosity, to create a path where none seemed to exist. The odds felt immense, and yet she realized that immense odds weren't immutable. They could be approached strategically, with awareness, courage, and timing. She wasn't simply resisting a crowd. She was learning to navigate a complex landscape of influence and expectation, one that demanded focus, composure, and the ability to anticipate moves before they happened. Facing overwhelming odds was not about matching force with force. It was about finding leverage in the small, precise actions that could ripple outward in ways that no single moment could capture. She could feel a shift in herself as she continued, an awareness that the weight of the odds sharpened her, forced her to be clear, to be deliberate, to refine her thinking in real time. The room was still full, the voices still numerous, but she began to see that facing overwhelming odds was as much about mastering her own responses as it was about confronting the external challenge. Every pause, every carefully chosen word, every nuanced gesture became a way to reclaim some measure of control, to carve space for her voice in a room designed to drown it out. She could feel it immediately, the way pressure compresses everything into a series of small, sharp moments. It wasn't just the people in the room, the numbers against her, or the weight of expectation. It was something deeper, a quiet internal force that seemed to press down on her confidence, questioning it before she even spoke. Every idea she had, every argument she wanted to make, seemed to hover in a fragile space between possibility and dismissal. Her confidence, which had carried her this far, suddenly felt exposed, as if it were being measured under a spotlight that magnified even the smallest hesitation. The first question came like a ripple across calm water, subtle yet revealing. It wasn't aggressive, not yet, but it carried an edge, an implied test. She realized that in this environment, confidence wasn't something she could take for granted. It wasn't static. It was active, living, fragile, and necessary to defend. Every word she spoke, every pause she took, became a statement not only of her position, but of her ability to maintain composure under scrutiny. She had prepared, she had anticipated objections, but the room had its own energy, a current that could easily sweep certainty away if she wasn't careful. Pressure doesn't always announce itself dramatically. Often, it creeps in through subtle cues, a glance of skepticism, a sigh that betrays impatience, a conversational rhythm that leaves little room for pause. Each of these small pressures chipped away at her initial assurance, forcing her to reinforce it continuously. Confidence tested under pressure is not just about belief in your own ideas. It's about sustaining that belief while others actively, even unconsciously, challenge it. She had to remind herself to breathe, to slow her thoughts, to anchor her ideas in clarity rather than emotion. She noticed how quickly the mind can betray you in these moments. One tiny self-doubt can grow into a cascade of hesitation, each thought magnifying uncertainty. She felt it, the urge to second-guess her phrasing, to soften her tone, to avoid confrontation even when it was necessary. She realized that pressure didn't just challenge the facts, it challenged the very sense of self. Maintaining confidence under scrutiny was as much about psychological endurance as it was about intellectual readiness. She had to hold herself steady, not because the room demanded it, but because she demanded it of herself. Every interaction became a test. When someone interrupted, she had to decide whether to assert her point immediately or wait for the right moment. When a counterargument arose, she had to respond with composure, avoiding defensiveness while still making her position clear. She noticed that confidence under pressure isn't about eliminating fear. It's about acknowledging it, accepting it, and choosing to act anyway. The pressure didn't disappear. She learned to move with it, to let it sharpen her focus instead of clouding her judgment. She began to pay attention to the rhythm of the room. Each reaction, each expression, each slight movement of posture was a signal. She realized that confidence tested under pressure isn't performed in isolation. It interacts with the environment. Her words were filtered not only through meaning but through perception, interpreted through layers of expectation and bias. She had to maintain not only the clarity of her argument, but also the steadiness of her presence, the confidence of someone who could weather scrutiny without faltering. Pressure forced her to refine her approach in real time. She noticed that what initially seemed like attacks or opposition often contained hidden opportunities. A pointed question might reveal a gap in understanding. A skeptical look might signal curiosity beneath the surface. Confidence under pressure meant seeing these cues without panic, using them to guide her responses rather than letting them derail her. It required presence, awareness, and a balance between assertiveness and adaptability that she hadn't needed to master in ordinary circumstances. The room seemed to amplify every fluctuation of her demeanor. She could feel when her tone wavered, when her phrasing was hesitant, when her gaze faltered. Confidence tested under pressure is relentlessly visible, impossible to hide, and impossible to fake convincingly for long. She realized that the only way to endure was to anchor herself in preparation, in knowledge, and in the steady recognition that pressure was temporary, while clarity and conviction could last. She began to experiment with subtle shifts, a measured breath before responding, a deliberate pause to gather thoughts, a careful modulation of tone to project certainty even when internally uncertain. Each small adjustment reinforced her sense of agency, reminding her that confidence under pressure isn't about perfection. It's about resilience, presence, and the courage to continue acting despite doubt. She felt a growing awareness that every time she held steady, every time she responded with composure, her confidence strengthened, not in the absence of pressure, but because of it. She noticed how the energy of the room interacted with her own. Pressure could feel like an enemy, but it could also become a catalyst. The more she engaged with the challenge deliberately, thoughtfully, and with presence, the more the room seemed to respond, not by immediately agreeing, but by listening more closely, by shifting the flow of attention toward her, by allowing her voice to occupy the space it deserved. Confidence tested under pressure, she realized, wasn't a static trait. It was a dynamic force, something that could grow, evolve, and assert itself even in the most intimidating circumstances. She began to understand, almost in a quiet, surprising way, that change rarely comes from a single monumental act. It doesn't usually announce itself with fireworks or applause. Instead, it grows from small actions, deliberate and consistent, that ripple outward in ways that are often invisible at first. In that room, surrounded by people whose voices were louder and whose presence seemed larger, she realized that even the tiniest decision could carry disproportionate weight. A single well-timed question, a pointed observation, a quiet challenge to an assumption. These were the sparks that could shift a conversation, that could make the difference between being ignored and being heard. She thought about how easy it would have been to stay silent, to let the momentum of the group continue unchallenged. One person alone often seems powerless against collective agreement, but she saw that power didn't always come from the volume of one's voice. It came from precision, timing, and clarity. She began to experiment with small interventions. A nod at the right moment, a subtle reference to a point someone had overlooked, a pause to let the weight of a statement sink in. These were tiny moves, almost imperceptible, yet they carried meaning. Each small action required intention. She had to be acutely aware of the room, of the flow of conversation, of the subtle openings that might appear for a comment that could redirect thinking. The impact wasn't immediate, it rarely is. A single point might be dismissed at first, or overlooked, or even met with skepticism. Yet those small gestures began to accumulate, creating a pattern. People started noticing that she wasn't just participating, she was observing, analyzing, and influencing the rhythm of discussion in subtle but undeniable ways. She learned that impact is often a compound effect. One observation might not change everything, but it could plant a seed. A question asked at the right moment could nudge someone to rethink a conclusion. A brief insight could spark a dialogue that reshapes assumptions. Each of these moments was a small action with potential for large consequences. She began to see that the cumulative effect of these interventions could eventually shift the dynamic of the entire room. Small actions also required courage because they were risky. Any single contribution could be ignored, misunderstood, or challenged harshly. The odds of immediate success were low, yet she understood that the risk didn't negate the potential. In fact, the very act of engaging, of placing a considered point into a room dominated by consensus, was itself an assertion of presence and capability. Even when her words were not immediately accepted, they influenced the conversation indirectly, shaping thought, prompting reflection, or inspiring another person to speak up. She began to notice patterns in human behavior that amplified the effect of small actions. A well-timed nod could validate someone else's idea. A carefully phrased observation could redirect attention to overlooked details. Even a brief silence could invite others to fill it, often revealing perspectives or contradictions that had been hidden. These were small interventions that carried outsized impact, not through force or volume, but through subtlety, awareness, and strategic placement. Her understanding of small actions extended to body language, tone, and presence. A confident posture, an intentional gaze, a measured pace of speech. All were small actions that reinforced the weight of her words. She realized that influence was not only what she said, but how she inhabited the space. Small gestures, repeated consistently, began to shape perception. People started treating her as a participant to be considered seriously, not as a marginal voice to be overlooked. She also learned that timing magnifies impact. A comment made too early might be lost, too late, and the opportunity passes. A question that comes after a key point has been raised can redirect the flow of discussion more effectively than a series of forceful statements. Each small action had to be calibrated, deliberate, and responsive to the moment. The skill lay in observing the room, understanding dynamics, and knowing precisely when and how to act. She reflected on the broader implications. In a room where she was outnumbered, where assumptions and expectations stacked against her, small actions created a ripple effect. They weren't dramatic, but they were cumulative. They shifted perception slowly, imperceptibly at first, but increasingly with momentum. Each small contribution strengthened her position, not by overpowering others, but by creating a chain of influence that was difficult to ignore. She recognized that small actions were also sustainable. Large, dramatic gestures are exhausting and rare, but small, consistent interventions build resilience. They allow someone to maintain presence, assert influence, and create change without burning out. She began to rely on these incremental moves, seeing them as levers, subtle, controlled, and capable of producing results far beyond their apparent size. She could feel the room subtly responding. Conversations began to pause differently, ideas were weighed more carefully, and a pattern emerged where her input began to carry weight not because it was loud, but because it was precise, intentional, and persistent. Each small action, though seemingly minor on its own, contributed to a growing sense that she mattered, that her perspective could influence the collective, and that even a single voice, exercised thoughtfully, could make a significant difference. She had always thought of experience as a personal journey, something that shaped her quietly over time, but in that room, she realized that experience could also reshape the expectations of others. Every interaction, every calculated move, every moment of observation had built a reservoir of knowledge she could draw on. What she had once considered routine, small, or even inconsequential now revealed itself as a tool, an arsenal of insights capable of shifting assumptions that had seemed immovable. Experience had a power that wasn't immediately obvious. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet undeniable in the way it allowed her to navigate complexity with confidence and clarity. The room was full of people who thought they understood the situation. They had assumptions about how discussions would unfold, about who would speak first, whose ideas would gain traction, and whose would fade into the background. They had patterns they relied on, habits formed from years of experience themselves, But those habits also left them vulnerable to being challenged by someone who had learned to read the room differently. She realized that her own experience had given her a kind of advantage. She could anticipate moves, recognize the unspoken rules, and exploit gaps that others might overlook. Experience didn't make her immune to doubt or error. In fact, the weight of past lessons often amplified the stakes of every decision. She remembered moments when she had misjudged timing, misread cues, or spoken too quickly. Those moments had taught her humility, the importance of preparation, and the need to remain observant even when confident. Every mistake she had experienced added nuance to her understanding, sharpening her judgment and enabling her to act with greater precision. When facing an audience that expected her to falter, she discovered that her accumulated experience was a quiet, steady force. It gave her the ability to anticipate reactions, to choose words and gestures with intention, and to respond to challenges with composure. She noticed how the room reacted as she began to draw on that experience. At first, the change was subtle, a nod, a pause, a reconsideration of a point that might have been dismissed. People started adjusting their expectations, not in dramatic fashion, but in the way they listened, the way they engaged, the way they allowed space for her insights. Experience reshaping expectations wasn't about asserting dominance or proving superiority. It was about demonstrating reliability, clarity, and insight consistently enough that others began to see her differently. Her voice carried a weight that wasn't there before, and that weight came not from volume, but from authority rooted in understanding. She also realized that experience gave her patience, the kind that allows a person to wait for the right moment rather than forcing every point immediately. She could observe, assess, and act strategically, guided by patterns she had learned to recognize over time. Experience provided perspective. She could see that immediate reactions were often superficial, that long-term influence required subtlety and persistence. People's expectations often rested on assumptions about quick outcomes, but her experience taught her to pace herself, to let small moments accumulate into broader shifts. Her experience allowed her to anticipate not just responses, but underlying motives. She could sense when someone's resistance was rooted in habit rather than reason, when an objection masked curiosity, or when a critique concealed uncertainty. These insights gave her the ability to shape discussions in ways that weren't confrontational, but still profoundly influential. The expectations of the room began to adjust because she was not simply reacting, she was guiding, gently, deliberately, drawing from lessons that only experience could teach. Experience also gave her credibility in ways that weren't immediately visible. People don't always recognize the depth of what someone has learned until it shows itself in action. Every carefully framed point, every measured response, every demonstration of understanding contributed to a perception that she was not merely participating, but contributing from a place of knowledge. As those perceptions solidified, the room's expectations shifted again. Where once there had been doubt, hesitation, or dismissal, there was now consideration, respect, and attention. She noticed that reshaping expectations didn't require force. It required constancy, awareness, and the application of lessons learned. Experience allowed her to read the tempo of conversation, to identify subtle cues, and to act in ways that maximized influence without overt assertion. Every prior challenge she had faced, every failure she had endured, every time she had adapted to unexpected circumstances contributed to a capacity to act decisively and effectively. Experience also reshaped her own expectations of herself. She realized that she could navigate spaces she had once considered intimidating, that she could influence outcomes even when the odds were against her, and that she could trust her judgment in moments of uncertainty. This self-assuredness had a quiet but powerful effect, reinforcing her presence and further altering the expectations of those around her. She could see that experience didn't just inform decisions. It subtly transformed the perception of authority and capability in ways that numbers, titles, or loud arguments rarely could. Her awareness deepened as she continued. Each small decision, each carefully chosen word, each moment of observation became a demonstration of experience in action. The room's expectations continued to shift incrementally, often unnoticed except in the way conversations began to flow differently, the way objections were tempered, and the way attention was given with increasing focus. Experience was reshaping the math, silently recalculating assumptions, and creating opportunities that hadn't existed before. She could feel the weight of the room pressing against her, the sheer number of opposing voices forming a wall that seemed impossible to breach. Every glance, every nod, every subtle murmur reinforced the reality she faced. She was outnumbered, not by just one or two, but by a clear majority whose presence and certainty made her feel small, even when she knew her ideas were sound. Being outnumbered can be disorienting. It can make logic seem fragile, courage feel heavy, and resolve waver. Yet within that very pressure, she discovered the paradox. Being outnumbered didn't mean she was defeated. At first, the odds felt insurmountable. The majority had experience, confidence, and numbers on their side. Their voices overlapped and reinforced each other, creating a current that seemed designed to carry the discussion in one predetermined direction. She could see it happening in real time. The room had a rhythm that expected compliance, a pattern that assumed agreement. But she recognized that being outnumbered did not equate to being powerless. Influence is not always a function of quantity. It is often a measure of strategy, insight, and timing. She learned to use the numbers against themselves in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Instead of trying to match the majority in volume or force, she focused on precision. Every word had weight because it was not part of a chorus. It stood alone, clear and deliberate. Every carefully framed question highlighted gaps, inconsistencies, or overlooked details. Being outnumbered made her presence more noticeable in some ways. Each contribution was amplified by contrast. She realized that when you are alone, the room listens differently, sometimes more attentively, because the anomaly forces attention. There was a psychological dimension to being outnumbered that she had to navigate. People often equate numbers with correctness, assuming that the majority view is automatically valid. She had to find ways to subtly challenge that assumption without provoking defensiveness or hostility. A gentle question, a fact placed with care, a story that illustrated a contradiction. These became her tools. She was learning that influence under pressure isn't about confrontation. It's about demonstrating perspective, clarity, and persistence in a way that cannot be easily ignored. She also relied on her own mental framing. Being outnumbered could have been discouraging, but she reframed it as an opportunity to refine focus. When the room is against you, clarity becomes your ally. You can't afford distraction, unnecessary words, or poorly considered arguments. Every point must be deliberate, every example purposeful. She noticed that others were operating on assumptions, habits, and reflexes, while she was acting with intention informed by experience and awareness. In this contrast lay her power. She saw how persistence matters when you are outnumbered. It wasn't about dominating the conversation in one dramatic surge. It was about consistent, measured contributions that cumulatively shifted attention, reconsideration, and engagement. A single interruption or challenge might have been dismissed, but repeated, thoughtful interventions built momentum. The room began to change, not immediately, not visibly, but in subtle ways. Pauses lengthened, questions were answered differently, ideas were weighed more carefully. Her influence grew incrementally, quietly, and deliberately. Being outnumbered also forced her to innovate in communication. She had to find the words, the analogies, and the framing that could pierce the collective mindset. She learned to read the room's energy, identifying who might be receptive, who was skeptical, and who needed time to process. She realized that being outnumbered required patience, observation, and a flexible approach, because the majority's strength lay not just in numbers, but in shared assumptions. By challenging those assumptions with precision, she could create openings that others might never have expected. The emotional dimension was equally challenging. Loneliness, doubt, and even frustration could creep in when faced with opposition at such scale. Yet she discovered that emotional resilience became a source of power. Remaining calm, measured, and steady in her demeanor amplified the effect of every point she made. Others responded not just to the content of her words, but to the confidence and composure with which she delivered them. Being outnumbered did not mean being shaken. It meant learning to harness composure as a tool. She noticed how even small victories accumulated. A single acknowledged point, a slight shift in consensus, a pause to consider her insight. All of these moments reinforced the idea that being outnumbered is a temporary condition, not a permanent defeat. The key was patience, strategy, and the awareness that influence is not only about immediate outcomes, but about the gradual reshaping of perceptions and priorities. Each small engagement, each carefully chosen word, each deliberate observation contributed to a subtle recalibration in the room. She also realized that being outnumbered sharpened her judgment. Every statement had to be precise, every argument tested for clarity, every observation measured for impact. She couldn't afford distraction or uncertainty. Outnumbered as she was, she discovered a heightened focus that allowed her to see gaps in reasoning, patterns of assumption, and opportunities for influence that might have gone unnoticed in a more balanced environment. This awareness, combined with careful action, began to shift the dynamic subtly yet meaningfully. The longer she remained present, the more she understood that numbers are not destiny. Being outnumbered is a challenge, yes, but it is also a lens that clarifies priorities, highlights strategy, and magnifies deliberate action. Each choice, each contribution, each intervention became more consequential, and with those cumulative efforts, she began to see the room responding differently, not because she had changed the numbers, but because she had learned to navigate them with intelligence, courage, and persistence.